commission, it's the public policy arm of Southern Baptists, and our job was we had a twofold job. One was to talk to Southern Baptists about moral and social and public policy issues, and to call Southern Baptists to be where we believe that the Bible would have us to be on those issues. So in that role, we were free to be prophetic, but we also were to go to Washington and when Baptists had reached a consensus, and sometimes we reach a consensus, sometimes we don't. Yeah. But when we've reached a consensus, it was our job to go to Washington and make sure that the Congress and the President and the Supreme Court and the United Nations, if it was a human rights issue, were aware of what Southern Baptist concerns were on particular issues. So in that role, we were to be just descriptive. In the first role, we were free to be prescriptive.
Okay, very good. I should also mention, Dr. Land, that you currently serve as a member of the panel of evangelical faith leaders for President Donald Trump. Can you just give us a little background, how you came to that kind of role? My understanding was you had some pretty critical concerns, or you voiced some
yeah.
actions.
Well, he was, the president was my last choice in the primaries. Okay. And when they called me after it became clear he was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party, I got a phone call from one of his staff members, and they said, "We'd like for you to serve on an evangelical spiritual advisory board for Mr. Trump." And I said, "Well, now you do understand he was my last choice in the primaries." I wanted them to understand.
Yeah,
he was my last choice in the primaries. I said, "But when it's a binary choice between Mr. Trump and Hillary Clinton, that takes me about 1 nanosecond to decide that Mr. Trump, at the very worst, is the lesser of two evils." And they said, "Well, we still would like for you to serve." And I said, "Well, fine, if that's the case, I'll be glad to do it." Mm-hmm. And the first question they asked me, they said, "Well, what is your first piece of advice to Mr. Trump?" I said, "Pick Mike Pence." Now, I'm not the only person who said that to him, but I said, "Look, there's nothing that Mr. Trump could do that would solidify evangelicals' confidence that they're going to have a significant seat at the table of a Trump administration than to pick Mike Pence, because there's not anybody in public life that evangelicals have more confidence in than they do Mike Pence." I mean, I worked with Mike for 14 years when he was in Congress, and I was working with the Southern Baptist Convention, and we could always count on him. He always kept his word. I mean, he's the 24-karat gold model. And so I was delighted when they ended up picking Mr. Pence, and it's worked out well. I mean, they're very close, probably closer than any president and vice president have been ever. I mean, they pray together, and we've met several times with the president, and we talk on the phone with his staff, and we've had the opportunity to have input. I think we're probably more responsible than anybody else for the prison reform package and for the opportunity zones. We were very supportive of his naming a list of Supreme Court people that he would use as candidates for the Supreme Court, and we explained to him that was of critical importance to evangelicals. Right. Polls showed that 26% of people who voted for Donald Trump, their number one reason for doing so were the Supreme Court and the other judges.
Right. Yeah, that's very good. So,
and I must tell you, Mr. Trump is a very different person in private than he is in public. He's much better listener, much quieter. He just is. It's almost like Jekyll and Hyde. It's been somewhat surprising, actually.
Oh, very interesting. Now, tonight our program is going to be a little different, because normally I just ask the questions, but I've asked both Don and Thomas to help me. Since we have you for this hour, I thought for sure we should ask you as many questions as possible. So our focus is to help our listeners understand what values we as followers of Christ should care most about to inform us as to who we might vote for. But before we begin to ask Dr. Land some questions, I'd like to offer a little perspective to guide us in our discussion tonight. We at NGIM talk a lot about Christ's first character. And tonight we want to discuss how that Christ first character that we want to develop in our own lives should play a part in deciding what values we should care most about, which will hopefully help us to determine who to vote for in this election. Dr. Land, Jesus taught in Mark 12:17 that we were to give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to give to God what is God's. And I remember my father teaching about this verse. He taught that in our form of government, we not only have an opportunity to determine who Caesar is, but we actually have a moral responsibility to God as followers of Christ to elect the best Caesar possible. And I'm just curious about your feedback on that. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's a sin not to vote.
Yes.
Romans 13 tells us that we're to be subject to the civil powers, which are ordained by God and are ordained for the purpose of punishing those who do evil and rewarding those who do that which is right. And that means obeying the law. It means paying your taxes. And at the very least, it means voting and being an informed voter when you vote and voting your values and your beliefs and your convictions. So I think Christians ought to be thinking about what are our values and our beliefs and our convictions, and what are the hierarchy of them. For me, since I was a high schooler, to me the number one value is the sanctity of human life. To me, that's going to trump everything else. If I have a choice between a candidate who's going to lower my taxes by 50%, but wants to protect a woman's supposed right to choose to kill her unborn baby, and that candidate's running against somebody who's going to protect unborn babies, we're going to raise my taxes by 50%. Right. I'm going to vote for babies and against my pocketbook, because I don't want to have to explain to Jesus someday, well, I thought my pocketbook was more important than unborn babies.
Yes, yes. You know, Dr. Lane, here's another perspective. I remember my father talking about this, that since we have to admit that no political candidate is perfect, we need to keep in mind certain ethical guidelines in helping us as Christians to make decisions about who to vote for. And my father would talk about the fact that sometimes we have to choose between what he called the greater good. What is the greater good in the situation? And not the lesser of two evils, the greater good, when we as Christians decide who it is we should vote for as a nation, as statewide elections, and even locally. Would you agree with this perspective?
Absolutely. In fact, we talked about, your father and I talked about that in relation to Trump specifically. Now, your dad had picked out Trump from the beginning. He felt that he was the best qualified person to be president in this particular situation we were in. Right. And he may very well have been proven to be right. I mean, frankly, having lived through that whole process, I don't think that any of the other candidates could have beaten Hillary Clinton. And I don't think that any of the other candidates could have survived the unprecedented onslaught by the deep state and by the media that Mr. Trump has had to endure. I mean, I consider myself to be a pretty tough guy. And I can tell you that if I'd had to go through what he's had to go through, I'd be in a fetal position in the Oval Office sucking my thumb. I mean, and he seems to thrive on it. I mean, he seems to draw energy from it. But I felt that at the very least that he was the lesser of two evils. And frankly, he's done a better job than I thought he would. I forgot that he's not a politician. And so he actually tries to keep his promises. Yes. And he's kept quite a few of them. I mean, he's kept his promise of 100% on the courts. I mean, his nominees to all of the federal court positions, district judge, appellate judge, and Supreme Court, have been absolutely rock solid, 24 karat gold. He said he was going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, and he did. Unlike George W. Bush and George Bush and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, who all said they were going to, but they didn't do it. He did it. Right. I've been impressed by the fact that he really does tend to take his promises to the American people pretty seriously, and he's trying to perform them.
That's great. So, Dr. Land, let me ask you this question. I just want to start with some general questions, maybe a little broader, and then we'll get into some specific questions. What is more important, the character of the candidate or their policies? If you were to choose one or the other, what would be most important?
Well, I think character is the most important, but it doesn't trump policy. Policy positions. For instance, you could have someone who could have a personally sterling character, but they could be pro-abortion. They could be lots of things that they could be for economic policies that would be ruinous to families and ruinous to the country, piling up enormous debts. So, I look upon the there's some things that are so that I could not vote for someone who was pro-choice, for instance, or pro-abortion. I couldn't do it. I'd have to, if I was forced to choose between two people who were both pro-abortion, I'd have to write somebody in. I might write your name in, David. I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. But it's sometimes it's difficult. This last election, we had a tough choice when it came to character. I mean, the president is in his third marriage, and I'm somewhat infamous for having quoted Harry Truman back when Newt Gingrich was running, and he was in his third marriage. And I said, Harry Truman once said that he would never knowingly hire a man to work for him who cheated on his wife.
Yeah.
And when he was asked why, he said, well, if a man will lie to his wife, he'll lie to me.
Yes.
And if he'll break his oath of marriage, he'll break his oath of office. Well, it's hard to argue. It's hard to argue with that logic.
Yeah.
When I said that, one of my secretaries at the ERLC decided she better call and check and make sure the boss had his quote right. And she called the Truman Library, and the Truman Library said, we've been getting calls about that all morning from the press. And some guy named Land quoted this from Harry Truman, and I had it right. It was from a 1935 statement he'd made, and I had it right. So they couldn't get me on that one. Once again, it's compared. I mean, Ronald Reagan was divorced. I think Ronald Reagan had the best answer you can have if you're divorced. He said, I didn't want the divorce. My wife divorced me. Right. And I thought John McCain had the second best answer you can have, which was the failure of my first marriage was my fault. When I came home from Vietnam, I was impossible to live with. And it's the greatest regret of my life, the failure of my first marriage. Well, but when you got two ex-wives, it gets a little more difficult. But if you're comparing Donald Trump's marriage record with Mrs. Clinton, I think in spite of his perhaps his moral flaws, he was more trustworthy than Mrs. Clinton was.
Very good. And Don, do you have any thoughts on this issue? I'm just curious.
Sure, David. Many Christians are concerned with the behavior of our president, obviously. He says he's a Christian, but many of his actions don't reflect Christian values.
Yes.
Christ said that we would know his followers by his fruits.
Mm-hmm.
In your position as a spiritual advisor, have you seen these fruits?
Well, let me be very careful here. I know that there are people who have said that they are convinced he is a believer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not in a position to answer that question. I would have to have a personal conversation with him.
Mm-hmm.
I know that he believes that Jesus is the Savior, but as you know, that's not enough. You have to believe that Jesus is your Savior, and you have to go from that third person singular to that first person singular relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I do know this. I've been around him, not every day, but intermittently for the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a different person now than he was then. And I'm not the only person who's noticed that. I'll just give you an example. I was at a state dinner at the White House the night before the National Day of Prayer, this last the year, not this last May, but the year before that. We were all seated at different tables, and they had, a staff member from the White House staff at each table. I was at the table with the chief of staff, but there was an evangelist who shall remain nameless, but a good guy. And he was seated at the table with Mrs. Trump and Mr. Trump. And afterwards, after the dinner, he came over to me and to another member of the advisory team, and he said, "Wow, I wasn't prepared for that." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well," he said, "he's a different man than he used to be." He said, "The way he talked to his wife, the way he talked to us, the level of spiritual sensitivity in the conversation, he's a different person than he was when I first met him." And I've seen the same thing. I can't go beyond that because I don't have the experience to be able to go beyond that. But I've certainly noticed that he is a more spiritually sensitive person than he was then. Would I want him to date my daughter? No. But I'm not voting for a son-in-law. I'm voting for a president.
Do you think that's Mike Pence's influence on him, perhaps?
I think it's some of it. I know this. I know that there were people who I have very close friendship with, who flew with him on the plane during the primaries, and they said every time that there was an evangelical on the plane and he knew they were there, he made them sit beside him, and he just pounded them with questions. Look, he didn't run into many evangelicals before he ran for president. I mean, why would he? He's a real estate developer from Queens, but he is fascinated by evangelicals. He's fascinated by what we believe, and he just wants to. And he's very quick study. I'm going to tell you right now, he's a smart guy, and so he's just asking questions and questions and questions and questions and questions. And for instance, I know one fairly prominent evangelical pastor who said to him, he said, "Mr. President, I believe that God wanted you to be president." And Mr. Trump's reply was, "Well, then if you believe that, then you must believe that God wanted Barack Obama to be president." And he said, yeah. He said, "I do." He said, "I think that Barack Obama being president was a judgment of God on the United States. And that your being elected president was a blessing of God. It was God giving us another chance." But I mean, he made that, he said, "Well, if you believe that, then you must believe that Barack Obama being president was God's will as well." He's absolutely fascinated by evangelicals.
Interesting.
If I were his pastor, I'd want to have a conversation with him about, is there a time and a place and a moment when you trusted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior and Lord? And is your relationship with him as real as any relationship in your life?
Right.
But I have not been in that role.
But would you say whether he is a Christian or not, as we vote, that should not be even an issue in our decision? What should be an issue in our decision is what are the policies, what values in the policy?
Yeah, I mean, we've had presidents who were Christians who didn't operate from a Christian worldview.
Right.
I mean, I give you an example, Jimmy Carter.
Yes.
I remember when Jimmy Carter was running for president, he said, "I'm a born-again Christian, and I believe in the basic goodness of the American people." Well, if you're a born-again Christian and you're thinking straight, you don't believe in the basic goodness of anybody.
Right.
You believe that the heart of man is deceitful and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So you're not believing the basic goodness of anybody. So Jimmy had a lot of what my wife's a psychologist, so I sometimes fall into psychobabble. What's called a compartmentalized attitude structure, where you have two contradictory opinions in the same brain, but you compartmentalize them so you don't see that they contradict each other.
Very, very good. Thomas, do you have any thoughts about what we've been talking about?
I just know it's been brought up as I teach in my Bible college, and I teach ethics, and this question of the character comes up quite frequently, and I think that's just it's this interesting interplay, because we talk about people's pasts and we talk about those things, and I know we're talking about how he's changed. I guess that's some question when it comes into politics, and because I know a lot of times the past gets drug up. We as believers, how much would you say when it comes to like the political arena, should we apply the forgiveness versus holding people because of what they've done? It seems like, I know with a lot of my students, we struggle to figure out what exactly that is. Do you encounter a lot of that, Dr. Land?
Yeah, I do. And, I mean, I'm aware of the fact that, the best predictor of future performance is past behavior. I mean, that's sort of a given in human nature. And so you certainly want to look at a person's past behavior. But at the same time, we know that we have the ability to be transformed. I mean, the whole white privilege thing, the idea that if you're white, you're a racist, you can't help but be a racist. You can't help it. Well, I think we can agree that Saul of Tarsus was pretty prejudiced against Gentiles when he was Saul of Tarsus. But then when he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, Jesus made him an apostle to the Gentiles.
Right.
And he was changed. I mean, as Christians, we're twice born men. We're born again from above, and we're a new kind of man that didn't exist before Pentecost. That's what Ephesians 2 tells us. And there's nothing we can't overcome in Christ, in our backgrounds or in our upbringing. I think that once again, you have to try to make a prudential decision based upon the character of the person, and also what their policies are and what the alternatives are. I mean, best I can tell, Joe Biden hasn't been right about any foreign policy decision since he's been in the Senate. I mean, 47 years and he hadn't been right. We think he'd be right once just by the luck of the draw. My East Texas grandmother said that even a broken clock's right twice a day. But I mean, he was opposed to zapping bin Laden. He was opposed to Reagan putting missiles in Europe, which brought about the end of the Cold War. I mean, he's been wrong. Well, the best predictor of future behavior is past performance. So I can't really expect Mr. Biden to be any more wise in his foreign policy decisions in the future than he has been in the past. Just for instance, today, Mr. Trump has gotten another Arab country to make a peace treaty with Israel. That's 3 in the last 3 months, and that's 3 more than none of them have done it since 1994. Well, the reason is because he pulled the plug on the Iran agreement. He zapped their biggest terrorist leader, and he's standing tall against Iran, which has given the Arab states, the feeling that the U.S. has their back, and so they are forming an Arab-Israeli alliance against the main bad guy in the Middle East, which is Iran. Well, Biden wants to get back in bed with Iran. He wants to go back into the Iran deal and get back in bed with Iran, which is going to pull the rug out from under the peace treaty. The president's on the verge of building an entirely new balance of power in the Middle East, and that'll all go down the drain if Mr. Biden comes in, because he won't have the good sense to see what's being done.
Yes. Dr. Land, to help our listeners, let me ask you a more general question. I'm sure you probably know the answer to this. My father, what did my father say happened in the 1970s through the 90s in our American culture? What happened, and what did he warn us what happened because of the moral decisions that were made during that time period?
I think he and I pretty much agreed that we took a wrong turn as a country in the 1960s. And we began to emphasize rights and privileges at the expense of obligations and responsibilities. And that led to narcissism. The unholy trinity of most modern Americans is I, myself, and me. And we want to be our own definition of truth. We want to be free to do whatever we want to do. We convince ourselves it's not going to have any impact on anybody else, so we have the right to do whatever we want to, which of course is untrue. Right. But I think that as we have emphasized rights and privileges, and we have de-emphasized obligations and responsibilities, it's led to a huge increase in divorce, a huge increase in adultery. I went to my 50th high school reunion about 4 years ago, and I went to a big high school in a working class neighborhood in Houston, and we were talking about how fortunate we were. There were 971 people in my graduating class, and we were talking about how lucky we were. None of us had a lot of money. I mean, all of us were working class kids, but all of us had our fathers in the home. We didn't know anybody who was divorced. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that all of our parents had happy marriages, but they had made promises and they had commitments and obligations, and they fulfilled their obligations and their responsibilities. Today, we have 41% of our children start life without a father because they're born illegitimately.
Yeah.
And by the time they're 6 years old, over half of our children have lost their father in the home. As far as I'm concerned, that's collective societal child abuse.
Let me just mention a few statistics. Since 1962, teen pregnancy is up 400%. Sexual activity among 15-year-olds is up 1,000%. Teens arrested for aggravated assault up 300%, 500% a year to over 2,200. Violent crime up 660%. Single parent households up almost 100%. And depression among children up 1,000%.
Yep.
And then more and more statistics. So with this in mind, how should these change values that we see that's happening in our culture? How should that help us to decide who to vote for in this election?
Well, I think we need leaders who are going to put the government on the side of encouraging better behavior. That which you tax, you get less of, and that which you subsidize, you get more of. It's one of the oldest rules of public policy. Well, since the 1960s, we have been subsidizing illegitimacy through the Great Society programs. We have made single mothers and children viable economic units. And we shouldn't be surprised that we're getting a huge increase in the number of such families, mothers and children and no fathers. Secondly, we have not kept pace with inflation when it comes to the standard deduction for dependents. And so an average family of four making an average family income in 1952 was paying 2% of its income in income taxes. The same family today is paying 24% of their taxes, of their income in taxes, which has puts a strain on the family, and you get less stable family formation. I think the government could be doing lots of things that it's not doing to help encourage marriage. I know that George W. Bush tried to start a policy of having government programs to help people who may not have grown up in a stable, intact family. That's not just a middle class thing. That you can be married and you can break that cycle. And the Democrats strongly opposed it because they wanted to be neutral about this. They did not want to focus on marriage. We have enough statistics to fill libraries to show that the greatest advantage that an American child can have today is to be born into an intact family, and the family stays intact. It trumps everything else when it comes to success. It trumps ethnicity. It trumps whether you're rural or urban or suburban. It trumps IQ. It trumps everything. If you are born into such a family, you are 5 times less likely to be sexually active before you're an adult. You're about 5 times less likely to be molested sexually or physically. And the one reason for that is that, we've grown up with this. And so we sort of don't realize how unique it is. But we have more children domiciled in dwellings with men and boys to whom they are not biologically related than any society in human history. And they're called stepfathers, they're called stepbrothers, and they're called live-in boyfriends. And it's resulted in a catastrophic increase in child molestation in the home, with all of the consequences of that emotionally and spiritually and physically. They're less likely, children who are raised in an intact family are more likely to get married, stay married. They're less likely to experiment with illegal drugs. They're more likely to finish college. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on and on. And yet we have allowed no fault divorce. And Ronald Reagan said that was the greatest mistake that he made as governor of California, and even worse than being one of the governors to pass one of the most liberal abortion laws before he became pro-life, it was no-fault divorce. It is catastrophic for children. If we're looking out for the welfare of children, no-fault divorce is a catastrophe for children.
So let me ask you another question, Dr. Lynn. One objection I hear over and over concerns this kind of perspective, that we should not mix God and government, religion and politics, morals and politics. How should we respond to these kinds of objections when they come up?
With the patience you'd have with someone who has a double-digit IQ. That's just one of the dumbest things ever to say. Now, when I was a teenager, people were saying in Baptist circles, well, you can't legislate morality.
Right.
Now, what they meant by that was that they didn't want to have any integration laws. I mean, to be frank,
right.
They were perfectly willing to legislate morality when it came to restrictions on alcohol or restrictions on tobacco sales. John Kennedy once said that the greatest enemy of the truth is not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. And it's a persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic myth to say you can't legislate morality.
Right.
Somebody's morality is going to get legislated.
That's right.
Romans 13, God says he ordained the civil magistrate to punish those who do evil and to reward that which is good. If you take away from government the ability to judge right and wrong, then you've taken away from government the one reason God gave us government in the first place. Laws against murder, laws against theft, laws against rape, laws against abortion are the legislation of morality.
Right.
And when you're passing laws against rape and against murder and against theft and against abortion, you are not. What you're doing is you're trying to protect the rights of those who are being victimized against their will. Rape is not between consenting adults in private. Murder is not between consenting adults in private. Abortion is not between consenting adults in private. It's somebody doing something to somebody else against their will. And we believe government has a right and an obligation to protect the innocent and to protect the weak, to protect those who are being victimized. Right. Laws against racial discrimination. Racial discrimination is not between consenting adults in private. Somebody is denying somebody else their civil right against their will. And we have an obligation and a responsibility to say you can't do that. Right. To me, we need, Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from the Birmingham jail, which I think every American should have to read before they graduate from high school. He said in his letter from the Birmingham jail that Christians are supposed to be thermostats, not thermometers. We should be people who are setting the spiritual temperature of society, not merely recording it or reflecting it.
Right.
That's what being salt and light means.
So let me ask you this question. From the time of President Jimmy Carter until today, what values, in your opinion, have changed both in the Democrat and the Republican Party in general? Because I think it would be helpful.
Well, in the society at large, we have been engulfed, submerged in moral relativism. Back in the 60s, there were some pretty significant disagreements about what the absolutes were, but we still believed in absolutes.
Right.
Starting with the late 70s, sort of coincidental with Jimmy Carter's presidency, I don't blame him for doing it, but the reality is that we moved to moral relativism, where everybody does that which is right in their own eyes, and we believe that everybody has their own idiosyncratic view of truth. And the only absolute is that there are no absolutes. And when you have that society, the only thing that people can't tolerate are people who don't believe people who do believe in absolutes, which means that you're considered intolerant when you say that certain behaviors are always wrong and certain behaviors are always right. It's interesting what's happened to our two parties. I've lived long enough and been in the right decades to see it. When I was a boy growing up in the 50s, whether you voted Republican or Democrat had more to do with where you lived geographically and your socioeconomic status. People who were poor and people who were not well off tended to vote Democrat, and people who were managers and small business people and people who were a little more affluent tended to vote Republican. And then it also varied on whether you lived in Texas. In Texas, you voted Democrat. There were no Republicans back in the 50s. But that changed, starting with Goldwater. When Goldwater got the nomination for the Republican Party in 1964, it ended the Eastern establishment's control over the Republican Party. I mean, it was a struggle to the death between Rockefeller and Goldwater, and it was for control of the party. And Goldwater won it, but it was ugly and it was tough, and it was a fight to the death. It came down to the California primary in June, and but from then onward, the Eastern establishment, the Rockefeller wing of the party, never had the ability. It became the party of the Sun Belt, and it became the party of economic conservatism. And then, in the face of Roe v. Wade, it became the party of moral conservatism, the pro-life party. After Watergate, only 19% of Americans identified with the Republican Party. If the Republican Party had not become the pro-life party, they would have ceased to exist. They would have been replaced by a new party in the same way the Whigs were replaced by the Republicans. The Republicans started moving toward pro-life, and in 1980, when they nominated Ronald Reagan, they adopted a pro-life plank to their platform. In the meantime, the Democrat Party, which had been, the party of the labor unions, the party of my father was a Democrat, my mother was a Republican, so I heard all this at home. They canceled out each other's vote in every election. My father said, well, the Democrats are for the working man. And my dad went to his death at the age of 92, convinced that Franklin Roosevelt was the greatest American who ever lived, not just the greatest president. And my mother's family, they never voted for him, any of the 4 times. The liberals, I mean, the moral and cultural liberals took over the Democratic Party in 1972 when they nominated George McGovern. They lost the election, but they gained control of a party. And they became the anti-war party. They became the party of moral relativism. They became the pro-choice party. And they were increasingly, I can't tell the number of people have said to me, well, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And in terms of the Roosevelt coalition, they did. In fact, Bill Clinton was elected because Bill Clinton started something called the Democratic Central Coalition. It was a coalition of more centrist Democrats, and he tried to pull the party back from the liberalism of McGovern and of the liberals that you see today, and he was successful. That's why he was elected. He was the most conservative guy who ran in '92 for the Democrats. Believe it or not, he was more conservative than his opponents, far more conservative than his wife. But ever since, and so then with Reagan in control of the Republican Party and the liberals in control of the Democrat Party, you've seen an increasing divergence. And that divergence is wide today. In fact, we are in a situation which we've only had once or twice in our history, where in the House of Representatives, the Democrat with the most conservative voting record is more liberal than the Republican with the most liberal voting record. There's no overlap. It's pretty hard to have compromise when there's no overlap, and the parties are pretty far apart. And I'll give you an example. And I know the statistics from the 2004 election. In 2004, it used to be, except at the very bottom, if you're really poor, you pretty much vote Democrat. If you're really rich, you vote Republican, unless you inherited it, and then you feel guilty about it and you vote Democrat. In the 2004 election, your income level was a lousy predictor of how you voted. It was only a predictor at the very top and the very bottom. In between, if you went to worship services more than once a week, you voted 2-to-1 Republican. If you seldom or never went to a worship service, you voted 3-to-1 for Kerry. If you were married and you had children, 59% of such people voted for Mr. Bush. Single women voted 62% for John Kerry, and single men voted 64% for John Kerry. you see a certain picture emerging here. You had one party which was a more conservative traditional party, and the other party is the Liberal Party, and that's certainly true today. Look at their platforms. I mean, the Republican Party still has a platform of calling for a pro-life amendment and protecting unborn life. The Democrat Party says that there should be no interference with a woman's right to kill her baby up until after it's born, and the government should pay for it. Pretty stark difference.
Very much, very much. So let me back up a little bit. Our founding forefathers' values. Why? First of all, what were they? And then why did we move away from those? Because I think this would be very helpful. As
well, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because you know, some of our founding fathers had their foibles. But John Adams said it, I think, best in 1798. And Adams and Madison were the main authors of the Constitution. Now, Jefferson was the main writer of the Declaration in 1776. But when they were writing the Constitution and writing the Federalist Papers, Jefferson was in France as ambassador to France. He was pretty much out of the picture. And it was Madison and Adams who were the main drafters of the Constitution. Adams said in 1798, when he was serving as vice president, he said, "We have a government that is designed only for a moral and a religious people. It is insufficient for any other." Now, he went on to explain that what he meant by that was that what you have in our Constitution is a noble experiment to take Enlightenment ideas of self-government and combine them with a Judeo-Christian morality. And our form of government only works if a significant majority of the people obey the law voluntarily, because they are aware that they are subject to a higher authority. And so they obey the law when nobody's looking. Once you lose that commitment, that commitment to a higher authority, then liberty becomes license, and it leads to disorder. And the government has to have a heavier and heavier touch in order to maintain order.
Right.
And when people are forced to choose between liberty and order, they choose order every time.
Yeah. Yes. Very interesting. Don, you have any questions you'd like to ask Dr. Land about anything that we've talked about so far?
Well, it's a little bit different though, but I've been asked this question enough times of myself, and it's that some people that I meet and talk to, they say they won't vote for Trump, and what they tell me is it's because he's a racist. Well, why do you think people think this, and what do you think about it?
Well, I think that people think that because the Democrat Party has spent millions and millions and millions of dollars, and their allies in the press have spent hours and hours and hours and hours perpetuating this lie. People who know him, people who've known Geraldo Rivera, for instance, has known him for 40 years, and he said he's the least racist person I know. He said the only color he cares about is green, the color of greenbacks. I mean, he just said, and there are lots of African Americans and Hispanics who work for him and have worked for him for 40 years for his organization, and they feel that he treats them extremely well and impartially. I don't think he's a racist at all. They try to make out some of his policies as racist. I don't think they're racist. We have an immigration program that is broken in about every way a public policy program can be broken. And we have the last American president who actually seriously tried to enforce the immigration laws was Dwight Eisenhower. From the end of Eisenhower's administration onward, we've basically had two signs up at the border. One said no trespassing, and the other one said help wanted. And we have allowed these people to come in, and we have exploited them and used them with minimum wages for economic benefit. And if you don't have control over your borders, now notice I didn't say close your borders. If you don't have control over your borders, you're not a country. There are surveys that have been done that show that 157 million people in Latin America would like to come to the United States. Now, I don't blame them. I would too if I lived in Latin America. but we only can absorb a certain number of people in a generation before we start becoming more like the country they left than the country they want to come to. And we have a right to regulate immigration so that we do not have more people coming than we can absorb culturally and maintain our culture. That's not racist as far as I'm concerned. It's not racist. When it comes to domestically, I mean, he is right. He's done more for African Americans in concrete terms than any president has in this century, for sure. Before the corona pandemic hit, African American unemployment was lower than it had ever been since we had started keeping records. Hispanic unemployment was lower than it had ever been since we started keeping records. From 2016 to 2019, these are Federal Reserve figures. Net worth of Black families went up 34%. Net worth of Hispanic families went up 68%, and net worth of white families went up 4%. So his economic boom is tilted toward the bottom of the scale because he wants to bring back the manufacturing jobs, and those are going to be filled by people on the lower end of the scale. The Black opportunity zones are providing more opportunity for Black employment than $600 million, I think it is being invested in private-public business partnerships to bring work into the inner city so people have a place to work. He has done more for African Americans and Hispanic, and as a result of that, he is going to get a significantly higher portion of the African American male vote than any Republican has in a long time. And the same thing's true with the Hispanic vote. Now, he does have a gender gap, and it's across the board. He has a gender gap with Jewish women, with Gentile women, with rich women, with poor women, with Hispanic women, with African American women, and I guess it has to do with his style. And they say suburban women don't like his style. Well, they may not like his style, but they're gonna dislike what Joe Biden does to their husband's checkbook worse.
Yes. Thomas, do you have any questions you'd like to ask Dr. Lynn?
I think kind of piggybacking a little bit, because these common things that we hear, and this is not so much directly like with Trump, so bringing it back more to a larger political arena, the growth of interest in socialism, because this whole idea of like helping the poor and using this, and I think the statistics show that the upcoming generation, high schoolers and college, is the most socialistic leaning communist generation that we've had. Very briefly, like what's kind of fueling this? Is there, I know we don't have time to go into all the finer points, but what's causing this? What's kind of bringing this about, and how do we deal with this as Christians?
Part of it is in brainwashing and indoctrination in public schools and in colleges, where we have not paid enough attention to the slow march of the socialists through the institutions, through the colleges and through public schools, particularly, but also in private schools. Part of it is ignorance, and part of it is, Winston Churchill said, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative when you're 40, you have no head. So part of it is when you start becoming responsible for bills, you become less socialist. Who is the government? Why are they taking all my money? I think also with the millennials, especially, I think that they've been hammered pretty hard by the downturn in 2008, and up until Trump coming in, they had not had the kind of opportunities for their own career development that we had, for instance, as baby boomers, and my children had as extras, because the economy under Obama, the economy was not growing. And I remember Obama saying that Trump says he's going to grow this many million jobs, and he's going to get the growth rate up. How's he going to do that? Wave a magic wand? Well, I hope Obama's been watching, because Trump did it. and we're going to have unprecedented growth in the third quarter, which ends October 31st. We're going to have maybe the best numbers in modern history in terms of the snapback from the coronavirus pandemic. But I think it's a combination of several things: ignorance, and being coddled. I mean, a lot of American kids, they're born on third base and they think they hit a triple. I'm thinking of the joke now about the fellow who his daughter went off to college and she had been a Republican, and she wrote back to her dad and said, I think I'm a Democrat now. So he picked her up at the airport for Christmas, and he said, well, how are you doing your grades? She said, well, I'm making all A's and B's. So what about Lucy, your best friend? He said, well, Lucy, she's been partying this semester, and she's got C's and D's. And he said, well, I think you ought to give half your grades to Lucy. He said, well, no, that's unfair. I said, welcome back to the Republican Party. Socialism rewards failure and punishes success. Capitalism rewards success and doesn't reward failure. The reality is, and anybody who has eyes to see can see it, everywhere that socialism has been tried has failed. It has lowered the standard of living, sometimes precipitously. Why? Because socialism is based upon a premise that is anti-biblical, and that is that men will voluntarily work according to their ability and receive according to their need. And we might wish men were that way, but they're not. They're not going to work really hard unless they get to keep a significant portion of what they make. Socialism is ever more concentrated on how do you more equitably divide never growing pies. Capitalism grows pies and then decides how to divide them. I personally think that the system that works best is a modified capitalist system. I don't believe in a flat income tax. I think people who make a lot of money ought to pay more income tax. The key is to not charge them so much in income tax that they stop working. Right. But you still incentivize them to work. If I came to you, David, and I said, I'm gonna pay you $10,000 to write a book, but you got to do it in the next 6 months. If you got to keep 7,000 of it, you probably find a way to do it. If you got to keep 2,000, you might say, I'd rather spend time with my family. When you get confiscatory tax rates, people just quit working. When I lived in England, we couldn't get our piano tuned. I mean, we called every piano tuner in Oxford. We couldn't get our piano tuned. Finally, I went until the guy came down to tune the church piano. And he said, look, I make about equivalent of $35,000 a year. This is before Mrs. Thatcher. And he said, anything I make over that, I got to pay 90 cents of it to the government. He said, I'd rather spend time with my family. So he said, we all make our 35,000, then we quit working. That's human nature.
Our time is coming to an end. I can't believe it's almost been an hour, but before we end, I want to show a video clip of Dr. Ed Heinz and what he said in our interview with him for the upcoming movie, Norm Geisler Not Qualified. Can we show that clip?
The challenge is today, in a postmodern world, where there are no absolutes, and in a culture with no absolutes, then the only virtue left is tolerance. You have to tolerate everybody's view and everybody's opinion as if they're either equal or there's some kind of a personalized, individualized, semi-sanctified individualism of yourself. So it's my truth for me, and maybe not for you, and it's all about me. And I remember Norm used to say, when society becomes completely secular, secularism will eventually lead to selfism, because if God is out of the picture, then it's all about me. And selfism always leads to materialism, and materialism never satisfies the human soul. It leads to an emptiness and a confusion that later morphs into mysticism. And he was saying that at a time when nobody was saying that. Long before his expose of Star Wars and other things that he dealt with, long before people started to try to redefine the whole creation issue that he was so passionate about, or the abortion issue, etc. There's going to come this era of mysticism where people are going to be more interested in, is there life on another planet? Is there an alternate dimension of some sort? If God's not out there, who is? That kind of thing. And I remember every time, he was way ahead of his time. Almost to the point you think, now, come on, Norm, it's not that bad. And then 10 years later, you go, yeah, it's that bad. I get it. You got it. We all need to get it. We need to understand it because we need to take the light of truth from Scripture and confront the darkness and emptiness of a human soul without God.
Amen.
Yeah, Dr. Land, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'd like to close our time by telling our listeners a story. I mentioned this a while back. One day I was on a plane sitting next to a professed atheist. But here's the statement that kind of caught my attention. He said, I think our country is going in the wrong direction. And so I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I think we need to get back to our founding forefathers' values. And I said, you mean like Christian values? And to my surprise, he said, yes. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think it means that some of those who don't believe that God exists, some atheists and skeptics, realize deep down inside that the only hope for America is if we return to those Christian moral principles upon which our country was founded upon. Isn't it time for us Americans to turn back to God?
Well, it's past time. It's past time. I must tell you that my prayer, which I've been praying every night, is, Father, give us the president we need, not the president we deserve.
Right.
Because if God were to judge us, I can't complain. I can't say it's not justified. It is. I mean, we have been living as a nation, we've been living a profligate pagan lifestyle. And we have to expect that at some point, God's going to punish us for child sacrifice. And that's what abortion on demand is. It's child sacrifice.
Amen. Well, Dr. Lamb, thank you for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
Yeah, from all of us, Thomas, Don, and myself, from all of us at NGIM, good night.
Good night.